We'll be talking about political cartoons, and we're going to be opening with Carrie Eaton, our education coordinator here at the museum. Then I'll be taking over the second half, and I can't remember if I said this, Derek Pratt, Director of Education. So take it away, Carrie.
Thanks, Derek. Hi, so I'm Carrie, and we're going to talk a little bit about political cartoons today. Political cartoons have a very long history, reaching back into the Middle Ages. Today we're going to talk about it here on this continent, and it goes right back to the beginning of our country. In fact, this one dates before we are even the United States of America. Drawings supporting one political ideal over another could be found pasted on buildings throughout towns, passed from person to person, and published in the newspapers of the day. This medium, which transcended the ability to read or write, allowed a greater number of people to participate in the political debates of the day and decide where they came down on a specific issue. After all, anyone can draw a cartoon, right? It is important to remember, however, that as we're looking at all of the cartoons that Derek and I are going to talk about, that every single one of them has a point of view, and they're trying to convince you of something. Much like partisan news and newspapers, political pundits, those talking heads, and social media posts of today, this was how the political elite whipped up what they thought of as the common man. In other words, us. For those who didn't have time to learn about the intricacies of political machinations of the time, the political cartoon broke down very complex issues into bite-sized images that everyone could laugh at and everyone could understand. This is essentially the meme of its day. This first example that we're going to talk about, as I said, predates the United States. This cartoon was created by Benjamin Franklin, and it was published in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, in 1758. This was during the French and Indian War, so we're before the Revolution, but it directly played into the Revolutionary War. This was in support of the Albany Plan of Union, which proposed combining all the colonies into a single political entity to defend against the French, while the colonial delegates unanimously approved the plan. When they went back to the individual colonies, they rejected it. So this is Benjamin Franklin trying to get the British colonies in America to join or die, exhorting them to join together against the French aggressor. It shows a segmented snake, and the labels are South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and the head is New England. It is simple, it's graphic, but it gets his point across. Together, we are a dangerous animal that can fight against the French, and apart, we are nothing. Together, we're a dead snake. Yes. Let me see if I can't get it to go to the next one. There we go. The use of political cartoons to stir up public opinion was still going strong throughout the American Civil War. It was at this time that a new artist, whose name you're going to hear a lot today, emerged on the scene, Thomas Nast. Nast was born in Germany in 1840 and emigrated to America in 1846. So he was 6 years old when he stepped off the boat in New York City. He studied art at the National Academy of Design in New York City. And by 18 years old, he was hired at Harper's Weekly, where he would stay for the majority of his career. John Adler, in his Nast biography, explains that Nast was the first journalist who didn't own his paper to play a major role in shaping public opinion. However, he could not have done so without the quality, consistency, and financial strength resultant of the reach and dominance of Harper's Weekly, the country's leading illustrated newspaper. Its circulation exceeded 100,000 during the Civil War, as high as 200,000 in the course of major election campaigns, and close to 300,000 in the course of his, I would say, vendetta against the Boss Tweed, the Tammany Ring, and his Ring of Thieves, as he calls it, including pass along readership, because as I said earlier, these would have been posted on walls or passed from person to person. Nast's cartoons always had 500,000 to 1 million or more viewers. It's a key factor in his influence. Here on the left, you can see a photo portrait of Nast, looking very gentlemanly, from the Library of Congress. And on the right, you can see his own caricature of himself. He is, of course, in the trappings of his art, but he's made himself a little disheveled, so you can see how hard he's working. Thomas Nast worked at Harper's Weekly from 1862 to 1886, so 24 years. Fletcher Harper, who I love his name, formed the Harper and Brothers Publishing Company. There were actually 4 brothers in 1825. They began with Harper's Magazine, which was a monthly publication, but it became so popular that by 1857, they were able to bring out a weekly publication, Harper's Weekly. This publication was well known for domestic and foreign news, literary works by established authors such as Charles Dickens, William Thackeray, and Arthur Conan Doyle. In fact, the first Sherlock Holmes story published in a newspaper in America was published in Harper's Weekly. I said that specifically because my mom's here and she loves Sherlock Holmes. Yes, and there were many renowned illustrators who did work for Harper's Weekly, including, and probably most especially, Thomas Nast. John Adler, who not only wrote Nast's biography, but runs a Nast Harper's Weekly archive online, gives some context to the amount of output that Thomas Nast was creating while working for Harper's Weekly. He notes that Nast published almost 2,200 illustrations and cartoons during his 24-year tenure. Harper's Weekly was a tabloid-sized page, which is 16 by 11, and it enabled him to cram as many as 40 recognizable characters into a double-page cartoon, which would be 16 by 22. Overall, he caricatured 450 different people, which at this point the archive has identified 445 of them. So there are 5 people that they haven't figured out who they are. So if you want to go on there and look, they're always looking for helpers to help them identify who the characters are. Adding clout to his illustrations and cartoons, almost half of them were on those pages. He had 404 covers, 425 single pages, and 130 double page cartoons. This is Thomas Nast, again, diligently working. He's sitting on the floor. He drew this of himself. It is, of course, a cover of Harper's Weekly from December 2nd, 1876. And the caption on the bottom reads, "No rest for the wicked, sentenced to more hard labor." And he definitely saw himself as a voice. And so he had that drive to continue putting out what he saw as his voice into the public. Harper's Weekly and Thomas Nast were seen as influential throughout the Civil War. They supported the Union Army and President Lincoln while vehemently opposing the institution of slavery. His cartoons, especially this one entitled Emancipation from 1863, were so effective that President Abraham Lincoln called Nast our best recruiting sergeant. The week before this cartoon was published, Harper's Weekly ran the entire text of the Emancipation Proclamation. Nast then followed up that statement of support with this cartoon. One of the things that Nast was so well known for was his regular and repetitive use of themes, symbolism, and literary references. In fact, he references Shakespeare quite a bit. This created a sort of visual language that his readers came to understand. And you could read his hidden messages within the cartoons that he was sending out. The Emancipation is a double printed page and, of course, has a lot to say. The dominant center circle here shows a family, and it is entitled A Negro's Free and Happy Home, where the reward of faithful labor belongs to the laborer only. It includes a framed image of President Lincoln up on the wall there above their head, and a banjo on the wall next to them, which implied free time to learn an instrument and to enjoy life. And Union is inscribed on the stove that the woman is cooking on. Below them, in the smaller circle, Father Time has Baby New Year on his lap, and Baby New Year is striking the shackles off of an ex-slave to his right. On the left-hand side, we see the horrors of slave life. This includes whipping, branding, auctioning, being shot and chased by dogs down in the corner. This is then contrasted by what is the hoped for life on the right, which includes the benefits of public schools and paid work. While creating this language of symbolism, Nast would often choose animals to represent political figures, as we will see later with Derek's example of Web of Ruin. Now, the Democratic Party has long been known as the donkey. You guys know that one, right? And then the Republican Party is associated with the elephant. The Democratic Party has been associated with the donkey since Andrew Jackson's presidential campaign in 1828. This was because his opponents, rather unoriginally, referred to him as a jackass. And so that became the animal of his party. The notion of associating the Republican Party with the elephant came from this Thomas Nast cartoon. This cartoon was published on November 7th, 1874, and is entitled The Third Term Panic. And the caption under this reads, "An ass, having put on the lion's skin, roamed about the forest and amused himself by frightening all the foolish animals he met within his wanderings." And it's attributed to Shakespeare or Bacon. We'll get to that in a minute. This cartoon was a very pointed jab at Harper's Weekly's competitor, the New York Herald, whose owner was very against the idea of Ulysses S. Grant, who was a Republican, entering the ring for a third term. While not illegal, this was seen as a grab towards a monarchy. And this is why the donkey is in lion's clothing, and on the side of him it says Caesarism, is because this was the start of a monarchical system. And the Democrats were very, very mad about it. This cartoon is actually based on an Aesop's fable, The Ass in the Lion's Skin. And the moral of that fable is that although a fool may disguise his appearance, his words will reveal his true nature. To Nast, the New York Herald is not a roaring lion to be feared, but a braying ass to be ridiculed. The odd reference to the citation of either Shakespeare or Bacon, because of course it's neither, it's Aesop's fable, is a jibe at the Herald's owner, Bennett, who had strong contentions that Shakespeare did not write his works, but that they were all the works of Sir Francis Bacon. And again, he's calling out an opponent in his cartoon. While the Democratic donkey brays in foolishness, the Republican elephant is tottering over a large pit. And the pit is labeled Southern Chaos, and it's being covered over with Reconstruction, Tammany Reform, and inflation, all the things that are facing this upcoming whoever wins the election. while the elephant's foreleg is raised precariously over the chasm. Over on the right-hand side, there are two geese that are squonking loudly, and they are labeled Ohio and Indiana, and they are squeaking about the Democratic victories in those states. While all the way on the right here, there's an ostrich burying his head in the sand. And right next to his head is the word temperance. And this was referring to the Republicans in New York who nominated their own slate of candidates. So they're just sticking their head in the sand is what he's alluding to. On November 3rd, the Democrats won control of the House for the first time since before the Civil War. And Nast actually drew a sequel to this cartoon entitled Caught in a Trap, the Third Term Hoax. And that was published in 1874. And the Republican elephant has fallen into the hole and is sitting down in the pit with his legs up in the air. Yeah.
Could you move the cursor so they get rid of the menu so we can keep the bar?
Can I get rid of the bar?
I think if you move the cursor, it should.
Leave. Yes.
It's his laptop.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Hide floating the angels.
Perfect. Thanks. Okay, so the final cartoon that I'm going to talk about today before Derek takes over is another Nast cartoon entitled To the American Steamer, which we have in our collection here at the Erie Canal Museum. I actually found this print as I was working as the collection intern last spring, and it caught my interest specifically because it was referring to Irish immigration and women coming to America, which was the topic of my master's project, which is the girls exhibit behind us. This cartoon predates Ellis Island, so instead you can see Castle Gardens up in the far top there. Ellis Island didn't exist, and many of the immigrants actually ended up going through Castle Garden instead. Next to the label United States, you can see a very chill and nonchalant Uncle Sam, and on his shoulder is an eagle. In very stark contrast to him is the Anglo-Irish businessman slash politician who does not want the young immigrant woman to leave. He's dragging her back. And next to him is a very sad and bedraggled, kind of sheepish looking lion. And this is in very stark contrast to the bold eagle up in the left-hand corner. The signs entice the young lady in question to come to America. Wanted, million men, good wages. And so it's promising that jobs are plenty and the wages are fair. In front of her is a swarm of people all heading down to the steamer boats, trying to fulfill on that promise of good wages and job availability. Now, it's important to remember, as I mentioned earlier, that everyone has an agenda with the cartoon that they're drawing. And Thomas Nast was no different with this cartoon. While an immigrant himself, he saw the Irish Catholic immigrants from Ireland as a very different type of immigrant than his Germanic Protestant family. At this time, America had been mostly settled by Protestants. They saw the Irish Catholics as a threat to the American way of life, and they generally did not trust them because they thought that they would listen to the Pope above listening to the laws of the country. They didn't trust their popish ways. Nast was very much among those who felt that the Irish Catholics had no place in America, and he never really changed his mind about that. This cartoon is a prime example of Nast using his platform at Harper's Weekly to raise his own personal views into the public forum that he had acquired. He created many cartoons that featured his personal opinion, but never more so than with his greatest victory against Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed. And with that, I'll pass it over to Derek to talk more. Of England.
All right, thank you, Carrie. Yes, that's good. And a lot of these themes that we've been drawing out are going to connect very well with a number of canal-related cartoons in our collection. So we'll get started here looking at this cartoon. Don't worry, we'll zoom in on it a little bit, which relates to what Carrie was just talking about, kind of both Irish immigration and Tammany Hall. To understand this cartoon, The Web of Ruin, well, let's look a little into it. It's written by Thomas Nast, who is very much a Republican partisan for the most part. Tammany Hall, meanwhile, is New York City's Democratic political machine at this time period. This cartoon was published Harper's Weekly, November 10th, 1877. And it says at the bottom, "Come into my parlor," said the boss spider to the New York fly. And its main character, the big spider, is John Kelly, Honest John, as he's sometimes called. Carrie mentioned that Thomas Nast, his biggest, kind of most famous crusade he ever undertook as a cartoonist was against Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, who is stabbed up there in the corner, labeled a specimen, because Nast and allies, some of whom we're going to talk about, were able to bring down Tweed and some of the more corrupt elements of Tammany Hall, but Tammany Hall still persisted afterwards, led by John Kelly, pictured here. So a little on Honest John. He was the son of Irish immigrants. This is an important thing to note. Tammany Hall gained its influence in the era before the Civil War, largely by taking advantage of this giant crowd of immigrants, especially Irish immigrants moving into especially the Lower East Side of New York City. This was their primary voting bloc. Tammany Hall, their method of politics, it was less about ideology and more about practicality, you could say, or at least they would frame it that way. If we recall that last cartoon by Nast, many Irish immigrants are arriving in New York City impoverished. They need jobs and stuff, right? Who has jobs to give out? Politicians. They've got things, especially police officers. That's why you've got the kind of stereotypical Irish police officer, right? These Tammany Hall bigwigs are handing out political appointments to these Irish immigrants, saying, "Hey, here's a job," and then the implication is vote for them. And John Kelly is a descendant of these same folks who are entering the Tammany kind of experience. Kelly's the son of Irish immigrants, like I said, joins politics 1850s when the Know Nothing Party is especially prominent, which catered in mainly anti-Catholic immigrant bigotry generally. Luckily for him, when the Tweed scandal broke, led by Nast and others, he was in Europe doing Europe stuff, I guess. Not that important. What is important is he is not there to be caught up in kind of the web that takes down people like Tweed and his other associates. So right after Tweed goes to jail, he's going to take over, consolidate power within Tammany in 1874. And yeah, he is the head of Tammany. And you can see that in this cartoon. He is grasping over there under Tweed's body a ring labeled Tammany Ring. You can also see Nast's anti-Catholic bias in this cartoon as well. If you notice John Kelly's body, there's fairly Catholic style imagery of a crucifix and like stained glass windows, kind of showing the insidious papist influence within Tammany itself. And importantly for our story, he is reaching for another ring labeled the Canal Ring, which is a great kind of controversy that we are going to delve into a lot more with a few more of these cartoons. So let's talk about the Canal Ring. Oh, here's a zoomed in version of it. You can kind of see it a bit better. There it is, canal ring, Tammany ring. Rings are a really important symbol at this time. There's a million different rings out and about. This is kind of the time's parlance for like these overarching sort of conspiracies, etc. And there's this great fear of rings this time. They're all over the place. So let's look into the canal ring itself with this cartoon titled Squeezed Out. It is created by kind of one of the great rivals of Thomas Nast, a man by the name of Joseph Ferdinand Kepler. He was born in Austria, so like Nast, of Germanic origins. However, he's going to take a different tack. While Nast is a very generally Republican partisan, Kepler is quite pro-Democrat. He really gets his start critiquing the Grant administration, which we were just talking about, right? He's a pretty interesting guy. You would probably recognize several of his cartoons. And he is publishing at this point in Frank Leslie's Illustrated, one of the major competitors at the time to Harper's Weekly. He will eventually move on to Puck, where his most influential political cartoons are made. And like I said, Republicans are one of his big targets, as are big businesses, and he is generally a pro-immigrant, unlike Nast, as we kind of discussed. His son also will become a prominent cartoonist in his own right, Udo. You would recognize he's most famous for making like the Standard Oil octopus and stuff, those cartoons. And this cartoon was published April 10th, 1875. And we've got this man here, right, pressing down on a group. The press is labeled Governor Tilden's Message to the Legislature, Albany, March 19th, 1875. And in it, you've got these people being pressed, as well as a ring being broken, again, labeled Canal Ring, which leads us to the Canal Ring and breaking it up. And to discuss that, we've got to discuss the primary character of this cartoon, Mr. Samuel J. Tilden. So Tilden was one of those allies I was alluding to that Thomas Nast had in taking down Boss Tweed. Tilden himself came from a prominent New York family. They had grown quite wealthy, selling patent medicine, primarily Tilden's extract, which was made of cannabis. Yes, he moved on to the law, becoming a successful railroad lawyer, as well as a prominent Democratic politico, kind of a protege of Martin Van Buren. By the Civil War, he was kind of in charge of the larger New York State Democratic Party, even though Tammany's ruling New York, and he was a reformer. You might remember, Tammany reform was one of those planks that the Republican elephant was having to navigate. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Tilden, though, he really becomes a national and really statewide figure before he'd kind of been a behind-the-scenes guy, taking down Tweed and Tammany Hall, along with Thomas Nast. And it's so successful that he is elected in 1874 governor of New York, inaugurated January 1st, 1875. And it is early in his governorship that he will deliver one of his first addresses to the state legislature. It said March 19th, 1875, at which point he would accuse there of being a conspiracy within the canal department between state officials and private contractors who had jobs to expand and repair the canal, alleging that they were kind of working together to fix the prices on different types of canal construction. They'd lie about stuff that needed to be done, etc. And hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars were being siphoned out of the New York State Treasury to pay for these kind of various boondoggles that the contractors and engineers, members of the canal department, were engaging in. So in that address, he announced the formation of a committee to look into this and create a more efficiently managed canal system, which this cartoon, it's hard to see here, lists as well some of the proposed changes to the canal that he is suggesting. But you can see here, he is going to squeeze this canal ring out of existence, which leads us to our next cartoon, The Governor After the Canal Rats. Another Kepler piece in Frank Leslie's. This is published shortly after that last one on April 17th, 1875, when the canal ring investigation is in full swing. It's going well, and you can kind of see it. You've got Tilden there in what's labeled an Erie Canal lock, and he is, I don't know how you catch rats, but apparently that's how the old-timey way you did it, like killing these rats or scaring them out of the canal at least. And each of the rats holds in its mouth the name of a different canal contractor as well as how much money they were getting paid. Notable still within the canal itself are the names H.D. Dennison, J.J. Belden, and George Lord, who are often seen as kind of the ringleaders of the canal ring. Dennison and Belden are both Syracusians, so we got that going for us here. They're actually really interesting. So Henry Dennison and James J. Belden, they're both canal contractors, made a fortune doing it, scamming the state out of various canal funds. And they do it in a really interesting way because they're bipartisan. Dennison is the Democrat of the team, Belden the Republican. So no matter who is in Albany, the idea was you're getting those canal contracts either way, right? And interestingly, like Dennison, he was kind of the outgoing guy. He'd have these parties at his house, everyone would attend, and then it was Belden who he'd take him into the back room kind of and work out the deals where they were going to get their giant contracts. Lord, meanwhile, his brother was a very prominent New York State legislator, and he became a prominent, actually, Lord was also in the state assembly as well at various points in time, so quite well connected and made quite a bit of money doing canal contracting. But you can see we've also got Uncle Sam sitting up on the top, watching Samuel J. Tilden successfully hunting down these rats, saving the taxpayers all this money. And the caption at the bottom says, has Uncle Sam saying, if I can only, oh no, it's Tilden first. If I can only succeed in driving out these rats, I shall save the taxpayers of New York State $2 million a year. Which Uncle Sam says, well, Samuel, if you can do that much for a single state, the taxpayers of the United States will agree that you are just the man for us at Washington, where there are more ring rats and heavier taxes. Yeah, so this is referring to the same election Carey was talking about, that of 1876. Kepler really makes a name for himself criticizing all the rings within the Grant administration. There's a fairly famous cartoon of his of Ulysses S. Grant kind of in a circus holding on to these rings labeled the whiskey and navy rings, which were these other controversial rings going on, holding up his whole cabinet by the teeth and stuff, because the Grant administration is plagued by scandal and corruption at this time. So Kepler makes his name kind of critiquing the Grant administration and its corruption. Yeah, you could really make a killing as a cartoonist back then, finding corruption, because it was everywhere, seemingly. So, and you could attack whichever side. But anyway, as this kind of implies, Kepler is arguing Samuel J. Tilden should be president, perhaps. And indeed, after the success of this investigation, they'll get some early prosecutions. Dennison will be sent to jail briefly. The canal ring is sort of broken up, at least it seems so. Tilden is riding high nationally. He's now broken up several of these rings, both Democratic and Republican. So he seems like a guy who can unify the country, etc. Win a Democrat the presidential seat for the first time since the Civil War, is the thinking. Here's a close-up of that. You can see him. We've got Lord in his basket already. Down here, we've got Belden and Denison, etc. And he will take that popularity to the 1876 Democratic Convention. This is a newspaper we have in our collection of all of the candidates. Tilden is up there at the top with his broomstick reform he cleans out government with, in the middle, along with the other kind of prominent candidates at the moment. Notably, you've got Winfield Scott Hancock, the general who will become the 1880 Democratic nominee, and his vice president, eventual vice president, Thomas Hendricks, governor of Indiana. He's the man right under Tilden as well. I don't need to go into all of the people in this. Anywho, Tilden will, after a few ballots, win the nomination for Democratic candidate. This is another image in our collection. It is John Kelly being shot with an arrow labeled Tilden nomination. You can see he is dressed as an indigenous person. This kind of relates to the history of Tammany Hall in general. Tammany Hall is technically the Society of St. Tammany, named after a Lenape leader during the time of William Penn, who had become this kind of folk hero of the time. All these Tammany societies form. The leader of Tammany Hall is called the Grand Sachem of Tammany Hall. They use a lot of this indigenous imagery throughout, and it's kind of a really common practice at the time, etc. So that's why he's kind of dressed like that. But as you can see, Tilden's nomination seen as a shot right to the heart of Kelly and Tammany Hall. It's going to destroy them, right? Well, that's really not the case. 1876, Tilden will win the popular vote, but due to challenges in 4 different states, loses the Electoral College. And that kind of ends his political career. Tammany Hall will become resurgent after that. Kelly is going to remain in power until 1884, when he peacefully retires, handing it over to his protege, Richard Croker, himself an Irish immigrant. And the canal ring's going to really, the prosecutions that begin largely fail. Like Denison gets a couple months in jail. James J. Belden, who we talked about, is going to the next year run for mayor of Syracuse and win. Then he will found the Syracuse Post and also become Syracuse's congressman for several terms. So you can see justice was really served in that reform movement. And as we will see, corruption in the canal department does not disappear, nor do people stop making cartoons about it. Which leads us, we'll fast forward about 30 years to this final cartoon in our collection, titled How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth. So this cartoon, created by William M. Rogers, a cartoonist from Ohio. He actually will join Harper's Weekly in 1877, following the departure of one Thomas Nast. See, it keeps coming back to Thomas Nast. And depicted here, this is created 1904, depicted here are Governor Benjamin Odell and Thomas Platt. That title, How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth, comes from the Shakespeare play King Lear. So we can again see the influence of Nast's love of Shakespeare here. And then also it says Annals of a Business Governor underneath it. So referencing King Lear, right? What's going on here? I'm no Shakespearean scholar. I have talked to some literature majors since then. they've kind of gotten what's going on. So King Lear, right? It's about this old king who helps his daughters attain wealth and power and what have you, but is ultimately betrayed by them. That's actually the line, how sharper than a serpent's tooth, is in a larger monologue when he is bemoaning being betrayed by one of his daughters. And that's what's going on here. So Thomas Platt, pictured, he's the older guy sitting in that chair, looking very dejected. He's kind of our King Lear in this situation. He was the senator of New York State starting in the 1880s, and he was the boss of the New York State Republican Party. We need to be very clear, this is an era, like senators aren't even elected by popular vote yet. They're appointed by the legislature, so machine politics are what runs especially New York. May or may not be why, our primary system in New York works the way it does to ensure machine power. Anywho, not getting into that. Yeah, so Platt is in charge of the Republican Party, and he turns it into an incredibly powerful force itself. Throughout the 1890s, almost all of New York's governors are Republicans, and he is kind of a kingmaker. He's probably most known today for consolidating New York City into what it is. Takes the 5 boroughs and makes it one place. That's because the other 4 boroughs were pretty Republican, while Manhattan was solidly Democrat, run by Tammany Hall. So kind of waters down their power within the area. Anyway, that's getting a bit into the weeds. Like I said, Platt's a real important guy. He also is a major enemy, of Teddy Roosevelt, very afraid of this up-and-coming New York politician who wants to reform machine politics and stuff. And Platt's like, whoa, that's my whole thing. So get out of here, Ted. But he is good friends with the other man pictured here, Benjamin Odell, who becomes the chairman of the New York State Republican Party. He will actually convince Platt to have Roosevelt run for governor in 1898, kind of because Roosevelt's so popular, and they hope they can kind of sideline him there. However, that doesn't succeed. Odell actually will convince Platt to give his blessing for the next attempt to sideline Theodore Roosevelt, which is making him vice president. That doesn't work too well because at the western terminus of the canal, William McKinley is murdered and Roosevelt becomes president. Anywho, but when Roosevelt gets nominated for vice president, Odell is nominated for governor and wins, becoming New York's governor in 1900. He will then win the 1902 election, and now that he's won again, he's term limited, he casts aside Thomas Platt, which is kind of what's happening here. Remember, this is 1904, and does the whole King Lear betraying thing. So he's pretty upset. One thing Thomas Platt didn't want was a new expanded barge canal. Yes, but Odell wanted it, and in 1904, Will pushed that through in his last year in office. And we have up in the top corner of his office the new canal, labeled $101 million canal. So it's going to be expensive. What you might also note is that surrounding it are just words that say rock, 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 all the way across the state on the banks. And if you've been in New York, you know that we don't live on a giant rock, right? There's dirt in the state. But that links closely to, you'll notice there's a chain connecting the canal to the Furnaceville Iron Corporation. The Furnaceville Iron Corporation and Odell's connection to it were a major controversy at the time. This company, owned by a prominent Republican donor and friend of Odell, E.H. Harriman, they also diversified. They got into canal contracting. Odell also owned stocks in this corporation. The Furnace-Ville Iron Company was paid the rates that you would pay a canal contractor for cutting through rock when they had very clearly cut through soil, which was a much cheaper rate. So they got a bunch of extra money given to them for not the work that they had performed. It was kind of brushed away by the governor at first, saying that, oh, they'd already made this contract with Furnace-Ville, they were having to end it, but they were going to pay them these rock rates instead of soil rates to make up for, quote, prospective profits lost, which is what the SAFE also says on it. It also says you must know the code to get in here at the bottom. So this cartoon's pretty much saying that Odell, he's cast aside this important figure in New York politics, and instead is using state government to enrich himself with this new crazy barge canal scheme. He has these weird business connections that he's going to make tons of money off of. And really, this whole rock versus soil cutting thing, this is the same thing the canal ring had been doing, essentially. So you can see not much changed during that time. But nonetheless, the barge canal will begin to be dug, and it's completed in 1918, which leads me to the last bit of kind of political art in our collection. Not a cartoon, or at least on paper. Oops, here's a zoom in again. You can see, yep, rock everywhere, all the way from Buffalo to Albany. Yes. And that's this mug, my favorite piece in the collection. This is Smilin' Ale Smith, the Happy Warrior, as he was called. So this is a piece made by the Syracuse China Company. It has a sibling piece as well of Herbert Hoover. Ale Smith, he is a Tammany man, the son of Irish and Italian immigrants. So by this point in Tammany Hall's history, they still kept going with the formula of catering largely to immigrants. But now, right, the immigrants aren't Irish anymore by the turn of the 19th century largely. Instead, or the 20th century, now you've got a lot of Italian and Jewish immigrants, which Tammany Hall will very much latch onto in the coming years, including this young up-and-coming Italian gentleman working originally at a fish market. He works his way up. They also embrace a new style of politics, Tammany Hall does. You know, Platt had been beating them for years, kind of, and they move more towards populism and to reform. It seems weird. Tammany Hall, we always think of as entrenched corruption, right? But they're going to be led by Ale Smith and Robert Wagner, a German immigrant, who run on. They're these young guys who run on reform. Wagner is probably most famous now for what's called the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, kind of the most important piece of labor legislation in American history, which he gets through. Smith does that as well, reforming New York State politics in a number of ways. He actually becomes a star after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. He's kind of the lead kind of investigator into that in the state legislature, and he will get elected late 1910s as the governor of New York and will serve as that throughout most of the 1920s, which makes it so he is the governor in charge of the barge canal when it opens, and is also the governor when the Erie Canal has its centennial celebration. So he'll oversee both of those things. And like Tilden, he runs as this kind of reformer, becomes popular enough to gain the 1928 Democratic presidential nomination, becoming the first ever Catholic to run for president on a national party ticket. He will lose that to Herbert Hoover, who we have upstairs. But yeah, we got a great mug out of it. So, yeah, that's the end of our talk. Are there any questions for me or Carrie? Yes.
You talk about the collection and this part about the collection. Is it the collection here?
Yes, yeah, the Canal Museum's collection. And a couple of those Tilden cartoons were from the Canal Society of New York's, but they're located in our attic.
Available for the public to see this stuff, or is it?
So this is on display.
That's upstairs in the Onondaga Pottery exhibit.
Yeah,
You can see the Herbert Hoover one's right next to it. Rest of them are not.
yeah, the rest of
But
these
we-
are, yes, are in our archives. I was going to say, yeah, you can schedule research times if you want to look at them. You get several free hours of research time if you become a member at the Erie Canal Museum. Also, I know we do like for a fee, I can't remember what we like can release prints of these to you and stuff. So yes. I forgot to mention, I was gonna bring it up. Carrie brought up the use of animals to represent things. Tammany usually represented as a tiger. So yes,
Did you check to see if anyone on Zoom has any questions?
yes, there are
That's what's-
none. Okay, well, cool. You've all been a great audience. Thank you. And yeah, hope you have a good, happy holidays.